Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. I recently had an opportunity to chat with the legendary Fred Vail. It was a fantastic and fascinating conversation that I am honored and privileged to present to you here. Now, naturally, there is far more to talk about with Fred Vail than can possibly be covered in one conversation. From his early days in radio and promotion, to his many years associated with the Beach Boys, to his upcoming Cows in the Pasture album. For this conversation, we went deep instead of wide, concentrating on his early years and his first meetings with the Beach Boys. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Don, who goes by Daddy Bog here on YouTube, for putting me in touch with Mr. Vail. Also, I thought I'd mention that I had some technical problems with the recording. I've overcome those, but this episode and the follow-up episode will look a little bit more like a podcast than my usual fare. Now, please enjoy part one of my conversation with Fred Vail. I'm here today with Fred Vail, famed promoter and co-manager of the Beach Boys. His association with the group goes all the way back to 1963. He was famously witness to Mike and Brian working on Warmth of the Sun on the night of November 22nd, 1963. And witness to the mastering of Pet Sounds. He was a driving force in the creation of the Beach Boys concert album, and of course that's his voice introducing the Beach Boys on the album. In 1980, he formed Treasure Isle Recorders, which is still in operation and is now one of the oldest recording studios in Nashville. Thanks very much for joining me. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, which really amazed me, you got started so young. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that you were a country disc jockey when you were 12 years old.
Oh, that's stretching it, but you're close. You're on the right wavelength. I got started when I was 12 or 13 in radio. It was the dawn of rock and roll, mid-50s. There were actually 3 radio stations in Sacramento that played what we call top 40 or rock and roll. There was KRAK, KXOA, and KROY. On Saturday, a friend of mine had a show on KRAK, and he would invite me to come down on Saturday morning, and I would answer the phone. I was what we used to call a gopher.
Okay.
They now call them interns. That's kind of a high-class word for gopher. But a gopher would go for this and go for that. And basically, we'd bring the DJs coffee or cigarettes. We'd pull the weather report off the United Press International or Associated Press teletype, bring it in so they could announce the weather, answer the request line. And one Saturday, I was answering the phone, doing this request line, and he said, Fred, go get me a copy of the Saturday Sacramento Union, which was the morning newspaper. Open it up to the high school results from last night's football game. And I'm going to flip the mic open and you read the scores off.
Uh-huh.
So that's what happened. And it went off, without a glitch. And I stepped up to the occasion, and all of a sudden I'm talking on the radio and I'm 13 years old. Now, back in those days, the guys who were the DJs, disc jockeys, were either on the top 40 stations or on the country stations. All the other formats, all those guys were what they called staff announcers. So I wasn't old enough or had enough experience to get a job as a quote DJ, but I was able to talk myself into doing weekends and summer relief on the jazz station and on the middle of the road station. So between my junior and senior year, KXOA AM FM, where I had been a gopher in 58, 59, they decided to split their simulcast, meaning the same signal would go out on the FM channel that was being carried on the AM channel. So they decided to split and go country on their FM channel. Well, this is 1960, 1961. FM is a new medium. There was no FM in cars. Some of the nicer, more expensive home radio components had an FM tuner, but it was mostly an AM business back then. So they were going to start country on their FM band. And Jack Lawson, the operations manager, came to me and said, Fred, he said, you have a knowledge of country music. I've heard you talking about it. He said, we're going to change the call letters from KXOA FM to KCNW for K Country and Western. And he said, if you could bring in your records and call the record companies and get us on the mailing list for records, he said, I'll make you the midday guy and the program director. Well, back then, the program director would be like today's music director. We just programmed the radio station, set the music up and that sort of thing. So, I said, great. It was the summer. I didn't have anything else to do. So I went on the air midday. I was on from 10 to 1 or 10 to 2. And I got $1.51 an hour.
That's
big.
Not bad.
I would have done it for free. I was on the radio, This was a big deal.
Yeah.
I got to meet a lot of artists when they would come through town. And a lot of them I would meet were pop artists because KXOA AM was one of the two major top 40 stations. So I got to meet Connie Francis and Lloyd Price and Ray Charles and, good heavens, Bobby Rydell and, a bunch of people. I was going to high school. I was a gopher on the weekends, during summer, during spring break, during Christmas, New Year's break. I would go to concerts and I'd interview the stars backstage, and then I'd write it up in the high school newspaper, the El Camino. So I'm going to this high school, El Camino. I enter in the fall of 1958 as a freshman. Starting in your sophomore year, they had student body offices that you could run for. And now it's 1962. It was the second semester of my senior year. It was basically my last hurrah. I was running for commissioner of entertainment, which was basically in charge of the rallies before the big football, basketball games and the school assemblies. So there were 5 candidates. My campaign theme was elect Fred Vail your commissioner of entertainment and add a new twist to 1962. We all got to do a campaign speech in front of the student body in the boys' gym. So I said, if you elect me your commissioner of entertainment, I will bring recording artists to the high school for free concerts and free entertainment, which, there was nothing to base it on. It had never been done before. I thought I could do it, it's like, well, why not? Give it a shot, and I won. And all of a sudden it's like, well, now it's time to split up or shut up. I was lucky. There were 2 hotels in Sacramento that had occasional name entertainment. One was the Sacramento Inn and the other was called the El Dorado. And so I went to both those hotels, introduced myself to the managers and said, I'm Fred Vail. I'm a student at El Camino. I'm the commissioner of entertainment. Occasionally, if you have some artists come in to perform in your showroom, can I bring them out to my high school for a mini concert, do 2 or 3 numbers, whatever. And they said, sure. I mean, it was like, well, if the kids like them, then they'll go home and tell their parents, you got to go to the Sacramento Inn and see, the Diamonds or whoever. So the first group I brought in was the Diamonds, huge group here in the late 50s. They came out to the school and did Little Darlin' and the Stroll, and the kids went crazy, and I'd fulfilled my campaign promise. I was the hero for a day. So I'm going to graduate in June. So in May, I booked a show. Jan and Dean were on the show. I had met them at a Dick Clark show the year before when I was a junior. They were nice guys, and they would be a big part of my life several years down the road. And there's a TV kid named Johnny Crawford, who was the teen star of The Rifleman. And he had 2 hits as a singer. A San Francisco singer-songwriter named Bobby Freeman was on the show. He had a big record that he had sung in the late 50s called Do You Want to Dance? And then I guess you could say the stars were this group out of Motown called Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Whatever happened to them, right?
Yeah.
So I had booked a group called Skip Soder, and there was this other girl singer that was on the show. Anyway, so I brought those in, and then I booked my high school grad party. I booked Bobby Freeman back into my grad party, and I booked Jerry Wallace. So anyways, the kids that were juniors when I was a senior came to me around March 1963, and they said, Fred, we heard about your party, and we went to your assemblies, and we want you to book our grad party. And I said, sure, what's your budget? And they said $750. And I said, well, that's great. I can get you a band and maybe get you a duo or get you a single. And they said, oh, no, Fred. We have 750 total. I said, well, you don't even have enough for a venue. You don't have enough for catering. You don't have enough for chaperones or security. You'll never be able to do it. And they were devastated. And I said, but I've got an idea. This was the first of many. And I said, why don't we take the 750 and we'll buy a band, an act, and we'll put on a concert at the Sacramento Memorial Auditorium. And they all thought that was a great idea. But the school principal, Dr. Abbott, and the parent advisors thought that was a crazy idea because they'd spent the whole second half of their senior year raising the 750, and all of a sudden they're going to give it to Fred Vail, who just graduated less than a year before, and hope he picks the right act so they can make profit. The principal and the parent advisors mixed the idea, but the kids basically said, oh, hey, we believe in Fred, we raised the money, we know he can do it, give him a chance. And so they gave me the budget and said, now it's up to you to pick an act and put on a show. And so I started looking for an act. Well, the music had shifted from the twist to surf music. So every label had a surfing band. Most of them were not that well known, would not become that well known. There was the Challengers, had Blue Notes, the Lively Ones, the Safaris, which did have a couple of hit records. Dick Dale had a couple of hit records, and the Ventures, which had a couple of hit records. Jen and Dean had yet to have Surf City. They weren't on the radar. And then there was this group from Hawthorne, California, with three brothers, a cousin, and a friend, and they were called the Beach Boys. And they wrote these great songs, and they had these great harmonies, and they were unique. And I decided, let's get the Beach Boys. I decided to make some calls, try to find out who books the Beach Boys. I couldn't find them. After a few calls, I found this guy named Harry Kleschmeyer. He didn't represent the Beach Boys, but he would occasionally broker dates. He'd negotiate with Murray to buy the band for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Maybe he'd get them for $1,000, let's say. Friday night, you could have the Beach Boys for $400, and Saturday night, you could have them for $500, and Sunday afternoon, you could have them for $350. So he bought them for $1,000. He sold them for $1,250. So he made $250 with no risk.
Yeah.
Which was, pretty fair amount of money.
Sure.
So I told Harry, thanks. I'm going to keep looking, but I'll keep you in mind. And I don't know why, but I just figured that the Beach Boys have to have an agent by now because they'd had out Surfin', which had gone to 75 on the national charts. Surfin' USA on Capitol was climbing the charts at the time. So I called Capitol and I got a hold of a woman, and she was either in A&R or in promotion. I don't recall which. And I said, do you have any idea who represents the Beach Boys? And she said, I've heard that they've just signed a agency contract with the William Morris Agency in Beverly Hills. And I thanked her. And I called up the William Morris office in, North Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills, and the switchboard girl, she answers, William Morris, Beverly Hills. And
yeah.
That's Fred Vail calling from Sacramento. I said, I want to book a group called the Beach Boys. And she says, the Beach Boys? I've never heard of the Beach Boys. And I said, their label thinks that they've just been signed to your agency. Could you transfer me to your variety department? So she puts the call through, and the clock is ticking. You got to remember, it's in 1963. You make a phone call to LA, it's probably 50 cents to 75 cents a minute. For a kid making $5 a week as an allowance, the clock is running. So the girl answers, Variety. And I said, this is Fred Vail, calling from Sacramento. I understand that you guys may have just signed a group called the Beach Boys. And she said, yes, we just did. She said, I'll put you through to their junior agent, Marshall Burrell. So Marshall gets on the phone, and I introduced myself. Said, this is Fred Vail. I'd like to book the Beach Boys. And he said, oh, okay. What do you have in mind? I said, well, I'd like to get them on a Friday or Saturday in middle or late May. Well, he said, they're managed by their father, Murray Wilson. I'll have to call him, but he said they're available, so I'll get back to you. But they're between $400 and $500, to book them. So this is now early April, and I get a call from him, or I call him the next day, and he says they're available on Friday, May 24th. The problem is you're in Sacramento. Carl is in high school. He's a junior. He doesn't get out of school until 3 o'clock. They can't possibly drive from LA to Sacramento and do an 8 o'clock concert. It's 5 to 7 hours on the road. He said, I can get them for you, but it's either going to have to be $500 plus 6 round trip airline tickets from Los Angeles to Sacramento, or a flat $750. I realized the tickets were probably $35 a piece, 6 times 35. It was cheaper for me to just pay him $750, not have to deal with getting the tickets and arranging the flights, all that sort of stuff. So, okay, $750. So they issued the contracts, and it was now mid-April. Surfing Safari had climbed the charts. It had gone to 13 on Capitol. They had a number 75 record on Candex, and the Surfing USA album had just come out, and Surfing USA was starting to go up on the West Coast radio stations. So it was now time to set the concert up. Well, back in those days, there wasn't a ticket master. That was the thing of the future. So what I decided to do is I would put tickets on sale in record shops and musical instrument stores. And there was one main box office that sold tickets to the different musical and sports events. They were called the Civic Theater Box Office, and they took a small commission. All the other outlets, the musical instrument stores and the record shops, I basically got them to sell the tickets in their store in exchange for being mentioned on the commercial on the radio and being mentioned on the printed posters that I put up around town. And then we also sold them at the high school, in the cafeteria, or before school, at lunch, and after school. And then I went around to all the radio stations. And you got to remember, I had been a gopher at KXOA, KROY, KCRA, KRAK. I knew the guys at KFBK and KJML. I knew all these people. So they basically said, well, Fred, it's a school event. I said, yeah, they qualify for a PSA, a public service announcement.
Oh.
And so they said, well, you write the copy and you give it to us, and we'll give you all the promotion you need. So I got free advertising on the 2 top 40 radio stations. And tickets were $1.75 advance and $2 at the door, if I recall. I think it was $1.75 and $2. So we started selling tickets and getting spots on the radio. In the meantime, Surfing USA is now climbing the charts. That week, going into that concert, Surfing USA was the #1 record on KXOA and KROY. The timing was incredible.
And that's where we'll leave it for this week. I'd like to thank Mr. Vail for his generosity with his time and for an unforgettable conversation. I'd also like to thank Mrs. Vail for her help in getting this set up. Please join me next time for part 2. Meanwhile, have a great week. As always, I look forward to your comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.